Happy New Year to everyone who's listening. And I know that I was supposed to post a video yesterday, but I was enduring a very intense migraine. And I just want to say pause. That's the word that keeps coming up in me right now. The more that I'm going through this book and sharing it with people, the harder it's getting. And I'm in this next chapter, and I don't really know what to share. There's things in here about a certain person that I don't know if I'm willing to go public about. And so I'm seriously trying to take a moment and pause. I endured a lot of abuse on the outside from certain people. And when you're dealing with a narcissist, you're kind of afraid to go public with them because you don't know how that's going to turn around. I mean, this is exactly why I ended up in the place I was in the story in the first place, is because I told somebody, no, I didn't want to be with them anymore. And they lied. And they told my grandmother, who I was sharing finances with, that I was stealing from her. And so this is just really hard. You know, I picked up the manuscript and I was looking over it yesterday and today. And there's a big piece in there about a certain person. And, I want to be honest, but then I also have to be aware of my safety. And I think that the best thing for me to do is just to share some of where I was at. I mean, by this time, it had been over 2 weeks since I'd been brought in, and it was March 6th of 2020, and that was the 2-week mark that the waiver was signed to give Georgia permission to pick me up. I had seen the chaplain several times, and it was the same thing, of course, for me to be patient, trust God's timing. And then I was, still dealing with the shitty food, the same phone calls I was having back home with the same few people. And the best part about my meals was the peanut butter and jelly sandwich on those days that we were able to get that. And I remember just thinking I would never crave a peanut butter and jelly sandwich like I did when I was in jail. I mean, I don't even eat them now. So after I'd finished eating one of the inmates, she walked by and she said, "Hey, Georgia," she said, "why don't you just, you look down, why don't you just open your Bible to a random place and trust that that's what the message God has for you?" And so I did, and it was in Acts, and it was just suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said. The chains fell off Peter's wrist. Now, if that wasn't a message from God, then I don't know what was. I mean, it was perfect. So I thought, now my heart is clear. My spirit's clear. And I thank God for the work that needed to be done in me while I was in there. And that now I could answer the call that God had on my life. And so I'd found some other different passages as well that gave me hope. And I was reading a book that had some stories about Corrie ten Boom. And I was just ready to get back home and even study that more. I called my best friend Connie back home, and I was just kind of confessing her what God had done in my heart since I'd been in jail, and how he was healing the anger and the bitterness around so many different things in order for me to allow the light to come back in. And So this is the part that I really need to skip over. And by March 9th, 2020, I had wrote some lyrics to the song Oceans at the top of the stationery. And I had wrote, Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the water and take me deeper than my feet could ever wander. It was the same part of that song that I had repeated in my head as I approached Santiago with my backpack after walking a week in Spain on the Camino 3 years prior. And this had turned out to be another Camino for me. I just wasn't walking. I was having women back home pray for me and for my safety and that I would get home soon. And then I just had to trust that this was part of the process of having this traumatic event. And I was reading about how the Jews did Jesus, and Jesus was a Jew. And then, I started thinking about Christians and being prosecuted by other Christians, and how Jesus was still trusting of God no matter what the people were doing to him. And I thought about the day that I had went into the little church service at the jail, and I felt that pull in my spirit. And I knew that I needed to speak and tell my testimony about how I was being there for God to change my heart, that was, the opportunity. And then I told myself that I would never turn my back on God for another person. I knew that I was starting to need a lot of nature in there. Being on lockdown and having very little communication with the people on the outside, and nature and birds and trees and grass, and I was in dire need of this thing. So anyway, I went through the same routine on the 10th, where I got up, ate my breakfast, laid back down, took a nap, paced, waiting on the phone, and waiting to call my sister. And so this was March 10th, and she was able to get in touch with an attorney in San Diego about my situation, and he pretty much told her that this was standard, that legally Georgia had 30 days to pick me up, and that the public defender dealt with this all the time. So I had read many religious books, especially those like 8 days in the walk-in dorm. And there was this book, and it had a quote in there from Mother Teresa that said, live simply so that others may live, others may simply live. Stop using people and buying things. Nothing gets in between us like God and money. This author of this book asked a question, and he said, but who do you say I am? And it was a question about, if Jesus was standing in front of you and you wanted to say, tell Jesus who you said that Jesus was. So I just took the time and I wrote it down, and here's what I had come up with then. And this was March 10th, 2020. So Jesus is the carrier of God's love. He was one of the most important men to ever walk the earth. And now a spirit from that Christ wants to dwell within us so that we can do even greater things than he did. We can be healers and givers and lovers. And Jesus is on our side to protect us and to love us, and he gives us second chances. Jesus' works carry on through the people who open up and believe in him. This is where we experience the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says over 80 times throughout the Gospels, I am the Son of God. The contents of his teachings were so radical because it focused on conversion of the heart rather than an external behavior. Jesus gives us a mini gospel. And he says, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And you should love your neighbor as yourself. And it's interesting as I'm reading this, and it's been so long since I've read it, and I think about even the place where I'm at right now. And it all comes down to the transformation of the heart. Everything comes down to the transformation of the heart. It has nothing to do with where you live, what you own, how much money you're making, how big your house is, how many friends you have, how many people are liking your post on social media, how many people are watching this YouTube video. It all comes down to allowing yourself to be quiet, to be still, to read, to pray, and allow your heart to be transformed. And it doesn't, if you don't believe in Jesus, that's fine. But have some sort of spiritual faith that can transform that heart. So now, it was March 11th, 2020, and I had been inside Las Colinas for 3 weeks. And that's what I had gotten, was Jesus. And it was all about that Spirit working with me in me. He was clearing my heart. He was helping me forgive and love my enemies. He was ministering through others and used me to minister inside those cinder block walls. And I was returning back to my prayer life by spending so much time reading the Bible. And I was feeling that I was being reconnected after so many years of walking away from Him. And I knew that God was so much bigger than any of us. And I had to trust He was making a way for me to be released. And I knew that He was calling me to live by the teachings in the Gospels and share my gifts with those in need. I knew that if I was still at Las Colinas at 8:30 a.m., I would be returning to court. And so my prayer was, I have finished the race. I'm ready to return home and make all the needs that need to be made good. And, I just was praying to please put me around the people who I love as I reflect on the anniversary of my brother Jason's death. I wanted to be with family for his 1 year. And I wasn't released. And so because I wasn't released by the 11th, it was now March 12th, and I was ordered to return back to court and re-sign another waiver. And the women that I met on this trip were so much different than the ones that I had met 3 weeks prior. And it was the same process as I told in the beginning. The holding cells and waiting on the bus and then getting on the bus and going to downtown San Diego to the courthouse. And this time there was a female inmate that was placed in one of the cages on the bus. So when you first walked in on the bus, on the right were cages, actual cages with doors, where they placed women who were on suicide watches or who were behaving irrationally and couldn't just sit still in a seat. And she was climbing up those walls in that cage like a wild animal. I had never seen anything like this out in the real world. The other women were more focused on getting the driver and deputies to play music out loud. So I looked at her and she was sticking her tongue out and pulling down the front of her pants, showing everybody her vagina. Next to us on the highway was some construction workers that passed by in a van, and she was doing that to them. And I just wondered what she was going through, that she was behaving in this way. And then I wondered even more what type of entity was attached to her soul, because it just looked like someone possessed. And then we were ordered to start, after the bus went into the Sally Port at the courthouse, we were ordered to come off the steps of the bus. Again, we were attached to another inmate, and we had to go back through the metal detector. And as I was walking through the detector, I really wasn't paying attention to my surroundings. And after you walked through that detector, you made sort of a quick right and down a hall. And one of the deputies was hiding. And so when I made the turn, he screamed in my face. And he was like, ah! And it startled me. And he just started fucking laughing his ass off with his co-workers. I witnessed and I was a victim of so much disrespect while I was in there. And we were uncuffed and then placed inside the holding cell with that one toilet. And these women were taking turns using the maxi pads to stick on the stainless seat so they'd be clean when they sat down on it. And then they would pull them off and then flush them, and then it would end up stopping up the toilet. And so one of the women pressed the button on the intercom, and she said, hey, she said, this fucking toilet stopped up. She said, you know, get us another room. And they came back over the speaker and was like, good job, stupid. And I refused to drink anything that day because I did not want to have to pee in front of everybody. So again, there was no food, no water, no place to lay down. And then I heard, you know, Weeks, Helton. And the deputy was standing up at the door, waiting to walk us down to the courtroom cell. You know, place your hands against the wall. Do not turn around or talk. He jerked my wrist behind me, placed the cuff over my wrist, and then placed the cuff over my other wrist. And then we walked down several doors where on the left were inmates yelling at us again and sticking their tongue out between their lips. It was just like constantly feeling sexually violated and disgusted. The deputy uncuffed us again before putting us into another private cell together. And it was so cold. But it was the first time I had quiet in weeks. You couldn't really hear anything in this cell. And so it was just me and Helton standing in there. And she said, Georgia, she said, will you pray for me real quick? And I said, I sure will. And so she held her hands out and I took her hands and I began to pray for her protection and for Jesus to show up with justice against her case. We sat down on the bench that was connected to the wall, and every few minutes you could see a deputy walk by the door, the small window. And, she was like, thanks for praying for me. And I said, well, why did you get arrested? And she said, well, my man told me to tell the cops it was my idea to trick a young woman into sex trafficking. She said, he takes care of me, so I had to do what he told me to do to keep him from getting locked up. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was in her early 20s and living with a man who was over a sex trafficking ring. And he was enough mastermind to get her to take his damn charges. The door opened and we had to be cuffed again before going into another room to meet the public defender, which didn't make sense to me because there was a glass in between us and the room that the public defender came in. But every time we walked in and out of a room, we were cuffed and uncuffed, cuffed and uncuffed.